What if the madness you saw in the lighthouse wasn't entirely acting? There's something deeply unsettling about this film that lingers long after the credits roll. It's not just the haunting black and white visuals, the suffocating atmosphere, or the mythological symbolism buried beneath every frame. It's the feeling that what you're watching is real, not in the literal sense, but in a way that taps into something raw, something psychological, something disturbingly human. And that's where things start to get interesting, because behind the camera, the story becomes even darker. In the world of psychological cinema, method acting, and immersive storytelling, The Lighthouse stands as a perfect storm. A film designed not just to depict isolation and madness, but to induce it. This wasn't a comfortable set. There were no green screens softening the experience, no safe distance between actor and character. Instead, everything was crafted to blur the line between performance and reality. The cold wasn't simulated. The wind wasn't artificial. The tension wasn't entirely scripted. And when you begin to look at what happened during production, a different narrative starts to emerge. One where the descent into madness wasn't limited to the characters of Thomas, Wake, and Ephraim Winslow, but may have extended to the actors themselves, Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson. Long hours, extreme weather, physical exhaustion, and a director obsessed with authenticity created an environment that pushed everyone involved far beyond their limits. This is where the concept of cinematic immersion takes on a whole new meaning. Because in most films, actors simulate discomfort. They pretend to be exhausted, to be cold, to be on the edge of sanity. But here, those boundaries were deliberately stripped away. The suffering was real. The fatigue was real. And in some moments, the line between the actor's psyche and the character's unraveling becomes almost impossible to distinguish. You can see it in their eyes, in the way their voices crack, in the tension of their bodies, in the unpredictable rhythm of their performances. It doesn't feel rehearsed, it feels lived. And that raises a disturbing question. How far is too far in the pursuit of artistic truth? Because The Lighthouse isn't just a film, it's an experience rooted in psychological pressure, isolation, and the slow erosion of identity. It taps into archetypal fears, being trapped, losing control, confronting the unknown within yourself. And when those themes are mirrored in the real-life conditions of the production, something unusual begins to happen. The film stops being just a story and starts becoming something closer to an experiment. But to truly understand how deep this goes, you have to step beyond the screen. You have to look at where it was filmed, how the environment itself became a psychological trap, and why the cast and crew found themselves immersed in conditions that were far more extreme than anyone expected. Asterisk and maybe, in some strange way, that's why this story resonates so deeply, because it doesn't feel distant. It feels familiar. That slow psychological pressure, that sense of being trapped inside your own mind, that blurred line between who you are and what you're becoming. Almost everyone has experienced a version of that, even if not as extreme, even if not on a storm-battered island. So before we go deeper into what really happened behind the scenes of The Lighthouse, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt that kind of mental isolation? That moment where your thoughts start turning against you, where reality feels just a little unstable? If this theme speaks to you, take a second to like the video. It might seem simple, but it actually helps this kind of content reach more people who are drawn to psychological cinema, hidden meanings, and the darker side of storytelling. And I'd really like to hear your perspective, so drop a comment below and tell me. Have you ever experienced a moment where your mind felt like it was slipping out of your control? And if you're into films that go beyond the surface films that explore madness, symbolism, and the hidden layers of the human psyche, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Because what we're about to uncover goes far beyond just a movie. It starts with the place where all of this was brought to life. So let's step out of the film for a moment and into the place where all of this actually happened. Because one of the most unsettling truths about The Lighthouse is that the isolation you feel on screen wasn't just a cinematic illusion. It was built into the very fabric of the production. This wasn't a comfortable studio environment where actors could step out of character, check their phones, and reset between takes. No, this was something else entirely. Something far more raw, far more immersive, and in many ways, far more dangerous to the human psyche. The film was shot in a remote, unforgiving coastal location, constantly battered by wind, cold rain, and an almost oppressive grayness that seemed to swallow any sense of time or normalcy. And when you look at it through the lens of psychological cinema, this choice wasn't just aesthetic, it was strategic. The environment itself became a tool, a pressure system, a silent force working against the cast and crew every single day. Imagine waking up and seeing nothing but rough ocean, jagged rocks, and a sky that never fully clears. Imagine the sound of wind that never stops. Not for a moment. No real sense of comfort, no warmth, no escape. Over time, that kind of sensory repetition begins to do something subtle but powerful to the mind. It disorients you. It narrows your perception. It pulls you inward. And that's exactly the space where stories about madness, identity breakdown, and psychological tension begin to thrive. For Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson, this wasn't just about performing characters who were isolated. It was about living inside that isolation for weeks. The line between the external environment and their internal state started to blur in ways that are hard to fully articulate unless you've experienced something similar. Because when you remove comfort, routine, and connection, what's left is you. Just you and your thoughts. And that's where things start to get uncomfortable. There's a concept often discussed in method acting and immersive filmmaking. The idea that the environment can shape performance more deeply than any script ever could. In this case, the isolation wasn't something the actors had to imagine. It was something they were constantly absorbing. Every gust of wind, every freezing moment, every long, exhausting day contributed to a kind of psychological erosion. Not traumatic, not immediate, but gradual, subtle, persistent. And the more you think about it, the more it starts to shift your perception of what you're actually watching on screen. Those moments of tension, of silence, of unpredictable emotional shifts, they begin to feel less like crafted scenes and more like fragments of something real. Something that was happening not just within the story, but around it. Because isolation doesn't just affect how you feel, it affects how you think, how you react, how you relate to another human being sharing that same confined space. And when two actors are placed inside that kind of psychological pressure cooker, something almost inevitable begins to emerge. A dynamic that isn't entirely scripted, a tension that isn't entirely controlled. And that's where the atmosphere of The Lighthouse starts to bleed into reality in a way that's hard to ignore. Almost like the environment itself was shaping the story from the outside in, slowly tightening its grip, setting the stage for something even more intense to unfold as the days went on. If this idea of isolation as a psychological force resonates with you, if you've ever felt that subtle shift in your own mind when you're cut off from the world, leave a comment with the word isolation. I want to see how many of you have felt that quiet, creeping pressure too. And if you're starting to see this film in a completely different way, a like on the video helps bring this kind of deeper, symbolic analysis to more people who are searching for meaning beneath the surface. Because what happened in that environment was only the beginning. And as intense as that isolation was, it was only the surface of what was really happening behind the scenes. Because when you place two actors inside an environment like that, cut off from comfort, exposed to constant physical stress, and submerged in a narrative about psychological breakdown, something begins to shift. Not all at once, not in a dramatic explosion, but slowly, almost imperceptibly. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself, but reveals itself in fragments. In tone, in behavior, in the way one human being starts to respond to another. Inside the lighthouse, the relationship between the two characters is built on tension, dominance, submission, irritation, and an underlying sense of mistrust that grows with every scene. But what makes this so fascinating from a behind-the-scenes perspective is how much of that dynamic was being influenced, if not amplified, by the real conditions of the shoot. Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson weren't just stepping into conflict when the camera started rolling. They were living in close proximity, dealing with exhaustion, physical discomfort, and a kind of mental fatigue that slowly chips away at your patience. And when that happens, your reactions change. Your emotional responses become sharper, less filtered, more instinctive. Think about it when you're tired, cold, and mentally drained. Even small things can start to feel overwhelming. A tone of voice, a look, a pause in conversation. Now imagine that state being prolonged over days, even weeks, with no real escape. No reset button. No moment to fully detach from the psychological space you're in. That's where the boundary between acting and reality starts to blur in a way that's almost impossible to control. There are reports and interviews suggesting that the intensity between them wasn't always just performance. That frustration, that friction you feel on screen, it wasn't entirely fabricated. It was something that evolved naturally under pressure. And from a cinematic perspective, that creates something incredibly powerful. But from a human perspective, it raises a deeper question about what it actually costs to reach that level of authenticity. Because in psychological storytelling, especially in films that explore madness and identity breakdown, the connection between actors becomes everything. It's not just about delivering lines, it's about energy, presence, reaction, and when two people are pushed into a shared space where discomfort becomes the norm, their connection starts to operate on a different level. Less controlled, less predictable. Almost primal. You can start to feel it in the rhythm of their interactions. The way tension builds without needing explanation. The way silence becomes heavy, loaded with meaning. It's not just dialogue driving those scenes, it's the psychological state behind it. And that state wasn't created in isolation from reality. It was fed by it. And maybe that's what makes The Lighthouse so unsettling. Not just because of what it shows, but because of what it captures. Something that exists in that thin space between fiction and reality, where performance stops being entirely intentional and starts becoming a response, a reaction to pressure, to environment, to another human being mirroring your own unraveling. And when you begin to see it through that lens, the film transforms. It's no longer just a story about two men losing their grip on sanity. It starts to feel like a closed psychological system, where every element is feeding into the next, intensifying the experience from the inside out. If you've ever been in a situation where tension with another person slowly built up over time, where small things started to feel bigger, heavier, harder to ignore, comment the word tension. I want to see how many of you recognize that kind of silent escalation, because what they were experiencing in that environment wasn't just isolation anymore. It was something more volatile, more unstable. And as the physical and emotional strain continued to build, both actors were pushed into a place where the body itself started to reach its limits. And that's where things begin to take an even darker turn. Asterisk. And that's the point where the psychological tension stops being just internal and starts manifesting through the body. Because there's something people often underestimate when it comes to immersive filmmaking, and method acting the physical cost. Not the kind you can easily shake off after a long day, but the kind that accumulates. The kind that wears you down slowly, silently, until your body begins to respond in ways you didn't plan, didn't script, and definitely didn't rehearse. During the production of The Lighthouse, the conditions weren't just mentally exhausting, they were physically brutal. Freezing temperatures, relentless wind, heavy costumes soaked in seawater, long shooting hours. Everything was designed, intentionally or not, to strip away comfort. And when the body loses comfort, it also loses resistance. Robert Pattinson, in particular, pushed himself into a level of physical immersion that went far beyond what most actors would consider sustainable. There are accounts of him deliberately putting his body under stress to reach a more authentic state, spinning himself until he felt disoriented before scenes, running to the point of exhaustion, and even choosing discomfort over relief just to stay connected to the psychological state of his character. Now think about that for a second. When your body is disoriented, when your breathing is off, when your muscles are tense, and your energy is drained, your perception of reality shifts. Your reactions become less controlled. Your emotional responses become more immediate, more raw. And in a film that revolves around psychological breakdown, that kind of state doesn't just support the performance, it transforms it. But it also comes at a cost, because the human body isn't designed to stay in that heightened state for too long. There's a tipping point where immersion starts to become overload, where pushing for authenticity starts to blur into self-inflicted strain. And in that space, something unpredictable begins to emerge, not just in how an actor performs, but in how they experience the moment itself. Willem Dafoe, on the other hand, brought a different kind of intensity, less chaotic, but equally powerful. His approach was rooted in precision, rhythm, and an almost hypnotic control over language and presence. But even within that control, the environment still had an effect. Because no matter how experienced you are, when you're exposed to constant physical stress, your body reacts, it adapts, or it breaks. And what makes this dynamic so compelling is how these two different approaches, one more instinctive and physically driven, the other more controlled and methodical, collided within the same harsh conditions. It created a kind of energetic imbalance that you can actually feel in the film. A push and pull, a friction that doesn't just exist in the script, but in the way their bodies move, react, and occupy space. You start to notice the weight in their posture, the strain in their voices, the subtle instability in their movements. These aren't just acting choices. They're physical responses to an environment that was constantly demanding more than what was comfortable. And that's where the idea of performance begins to shift again. Because at a certain point, when the body is under that much pressure, you're no longer fully in control of every detail. Some things just happen. Small cracks begin to appear. And in a film like this, those cracks don't get hidden. They get captured, preserved, amplified. It's almost as if the camera isn't just recording a performance, but documenting a process, a gradual wearing down, a slow erosion of physical and psychological boundaries happening in real time. If you've ever pushed your own body past its limits, whether through stress, exhaustion, or emotional overload, and felt that strange shift where you're not entirely grounded anymore, comment the word limit. Because that edge, that thin line between control and collapse, is exactly where this story starts to go deeper. And as intense as that physical immersion was, it still wasn't the driving force behind everything. Because above all of this, above the isolation, the tension, the exhaustion, there was a vision. A level of control shaping every detail, every discomfort, every moment, guiding the entire experience towards something very specific, something deliberate, something that would push everyone involved exactly where they needed to be, even if that meant taking them further than they expected. And at the center of all of this isolation, this tension, this physical and psychological strain, there was a single guiding force shaping the entire experience, because none of it was accidental. Behind The Lighthouse is the mind of Robert Eggers, a director known for his almost obsessive commitment to authenticity, atmosphere, and psychological immersion. But here's where things take a different turn, because Eggers wasn't just trying to tell a story about madness. He was constructing an environment where that madness could emerge naturally. And that changes everything from the very beginning. His approach to filmmaking wasn't about comfort, efficiency, or even practicality. It was about control. Not in a chaotic sense, but in a deeply intentional, almost ritualistic way. Every detail, no matter how small, was carefully designed to serve a specific purpose. The aspect ratio, the lenses, the dialogue, the pacing, even the discomfort experienced by the actors, became part of the language of the film. He chose to shoot using vintage lenses and a nearly square aspect ratio, creating a visual frame that feels tight, almost suffocating. It's not just aesthetic, it's psychological. It traps the viewer in the same confined space as the characters. There's no visual escape, no sense of openness, just pressure, constant, quiet pressure. And then there's the dialogue. The script was written using archaic, historically accurate language, dense, rhythmic, and at times almost hypnotic. For the actors, this wasn't easy to internalize. It required repetition, precision, and a kind of mental endurance that goes beyond memorization. You're not just learning lines, you're adapting your entire way of speaking, thinking, and reacting. Now imagine doing that while freezing, exhausted, and mentally drained. Eggers was known for demanding multiple takes, pushing scenes over and over again until they reached a level that matched his vision. Not just technically, but emotionally, psychologically. He wasn't looking for performance, he was looking for presence, for something that felt real, even if it meant pushing the actors into uncomfortable territory. And this is where the idea of controlled chaos starts to take shape, because on one hand, everything was meticulously planned. On the other, the conditions were unpredictable, harsh, and constantly shifting. And instead of resisting that unpredictability, Eggers leaned into it. He allowed the environment, the fatigue, and the tension to become part of the process, part of the texture of the film. It's almost like he was orchestrating a kind of experiment, not in a cold or detached way, but in a deeply immersive one, creating the perfect conditions for something authentic to surface, even if that authenticity came from discomfort, from friction, from the slow wearing down of boundaries between actor and character. And when you start to see it like that, the film transforms again. It's no longer just about two men descending into madness. It becomes a carefully constructed system where every element is feeding into that descent. The environment pressures the actors. The actors feed into each other. The direction intensifies both. And the result is something that feels less like a performance and more like a lived experience being captured in real time. But here's the part that lingers. When a director pushes for that level of authenticity, when discomfort becomes a tool, when psychological pressure becomes part of the method, you have to ask, where is the line? At what point does artistic vision begin to demand too much? If you've ever been in a situation where someone pushed you beyond what felt comfortable in the name of growth, performance, or expectation, comment the word control, because that balance between guidance and pressure, between vision and limit, is thinner than it seems. And as precise and intentional as all of this was, there's still one layer left to uncover. Because when you combine isolation, tension, physical strain, and obsessive direction, something begins to happen that goes beyond filmmaking itself. Something that starts to blur the boundary between fiction and reality in a way that's difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore. Asterisk. And when you bring all of these elements together, real isolation, escalating tension, physical exhaustion, and a director orchestrating every detail with surgical precision, something begins to emerge that goes beyond performance, beyond storytelling, and starts to enter a much more unsettling space. Because at that point, the Lighthouse stops feeling like a film being acted and starts feeling like something being lived through. There's a subtle shift that happens when fiction is no longer fully contained, when the conditions around a story begin to mirror the story itself so closely that the boundary between the two starts to dissolve. And in the case of this production, that boundary wasn't just blurred, it was constantly being tested. Think about it. You have two actors, Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson, confined in an environment designed to strip away comfort. You have psychological pressure building through isolation and repetition. You have physical strain wearing down the body. And above all of that, you have a creative vision that demands authenticity at every level. At what point does that stop being acting? Because when a person is cold, exhausted, mentally drained, and emotionally pushed, their reactions stop being entirely calculated. There's less filter, less control. What comes out is more immediate, more instinctive. And in a film that explores madness, identity loss, and the collapse of reality, that kind of state doesn't just enhance the narrative, it becomes part of it. This is where the idea of psychological cinema reaches a kind of extreme, not just representing the breakdown of the mind, but placing the people involved in conditions where that breakdown can be felt, even if only in fragments, in flashes, in those moments where something slips through that wasn't fully planned. And maybe that's why the film leaves such a lasting impression, because somewhere, deep down, you can sense that what you're watching isn't entirely constructed. There's something unpredictable in it, something unstable, something that feels like it could go just a little too far at any moment, almost like the film itself is alive, reacting, breathing, shifting between control and chaos. And that raises a question that goes beyond this specific production. Something broader, something more personal. How far can someone go in the pursuit of truth, artistic or otherwise, before they begin to lose themselves in the process? Because The Lighthouse doesn't just show us characters descending into madness. It places us inside a system where that descent feels inevitable, where every element is pushing in the same direction, where the line between who you are and what you're experiencing starts to fade. And maybe that's what makes it so disturbing. Not just the imagery, not just the performances, but the underlying feeling that this wasn't entirely safe. That something real was being accessed. Something that exists in all of us when we're pushed far enough, isolated long enough, or forced to confront the parts of ourselves we usually keep hidden. If this made you see the film in a different way, if it made you question that line between reality and performance, comment the word reality. I want to know how many of you felt that shift while watching Dot, and if you've ever had a moment in your own life where things felt just slightly unreal, where your perception started to change under pressure. Hold on to that feeling for a second, because it might be closer to what happened on that set than most people are willing to admit.